Hey guys, nice seeing the names come in. A slightly more diverse group this time than we have sometimes, which is nice. I like seeing names I know, but I also like seeing fresh names too, which is great. I love how the community continues to grow. Um, Thanks for joining us tonight. I will start now so that I can get my intro over while people are joining, and then we'll get Tony on because I know he's what you're here for. So thank you for joining. My name's Karen. If you haven't met me before, I work for Betfair in Australia. I'm passionate about sports and racing modelling and automation. My role at Betfair is to try and support people who are interested in using data to build and backtest models and are keen to use, particularly from our perspective, our API offering to enable them to automate that those models in a sort of betting context. So if you haven't met me and my team, Ben and Ash, please reach out. You're always welcome to. Ash will chuck our email address in the chat at the bottom. So it's automation@betfair.com.au. You're always welcome to reach out, and we are always happy to help. So why are we here? So as part of that sort of supporting people with modelling and automation, I'm very big on supporting community. So we all know that modelling and automation can both be a little bit of an isolating field, particularly when you then take it into the slightly more sophisticated end of the wagering spectrum as well. So the more we can do to bring like-minded people together, the better for everyone. So that's where these meetups stem from. Someday we'll get back to doing them in person, probably as well as some online things, but for the moment we're still online. So at least that gives us the opportunity to join from more places around the country, which is great. At Betfair, our motto is to create more winners, which again is in the spirit of what we're here for tonight. If you haven't already, I do recommend going and taking a look at the Betfair Quants Slack community. Super active conversations on there all the time, from everything from modelling through what the value of home ground advantage is in the AFL. We'll get to that later. And then, if you're using the API, what's this funky error I'm getting? Really good conversations and a really great community. Ash has just posted a link to it. If you're watching this recording later on and you can't find it, again, shoot us an email and we can find an invitation for you. It's a great community-owned space. And it's always nice alongside one of these meetups to talk to other people who are also interested. So good place to continue the conversation there. All right, so today's going to be a slightly different structure to some of our other meetups. Normally we have a couple of different guests and we sort of have a group discussion. This time we were lucky enough to get Tony Corke to come and speak. So anyone who's interested in AFL at all knows Tony and knows matter of stats. And given that we have this opportunity, we wanted to be able to optimize it, I guess, is the nerds that we are. So we decided that we'd just invite Tony this time. So I'm very excited about that. If you haven't seen Tony's work online, where have you been? Look up Matter of Stats. But with no further ado, Tony, Ben, if you can turn Tony's camera on, so it's not just me anymore. There we go. Hi, Tony. Thanks for joining us tonight. Very, very grateful to have you here. Guys, I should have said before, we'll keep the Q&A box open down the bottom. So if you've got any questions through the evening, just drop them in there so that we can see them come through and get to them as we have time. But anyway, Tony, thank you. Can you give us a bit of your background? Are you a long-time AFL lover? I don't know, I think the answer is probably yes, but is that your background? Where does the passion for statistics come from? Does that play into your professional life? What's your background?
Well, I'm ashamed to say, actually, I'm Sydney born, so AFL was not my first passion. I was very much a rugby league follower as a kid. And through university, my degree was in econometrics. And since coming out of university, I've had a number of jobs, but the latest sort of set of jobs I've had have been around doing sort of the kind of predictive modelling work that you see me do on a matter of stats. And what I found was when I started to think about what I wanted to model first as a sport, when I looked at rugby league and I looked at AFL, at that time, and that was, I'm ashamed to say, 15 years ago now, it was actually much easier to predict AFL, I found, than to predict NRL. Now, I think
that's still true.
I think that is, although less so, I think because in the old days when teams had their own unique home grounds in the AFL, that made a hell of a difference. And I think the teams didn't really realise how much they were giving away when they decided to have shared home grounds. I think you're right. I think AFL still probably is more predictable than NRL. But in any case, sort of 15, 16 years ago, I started off on this journey at the behest of a few friends to start doing some newsletters about predicting AFL football. And here I am 15 years later, still doing the same thing. And I must admit, I have now grown a pretty distinct passion for the game. What I love about it in particular is what I can call the degrees of freedom that players have compared to other sports. Someone in possession of the ball has got so many more options than in so many other sports. And that's one of the things that I really love about that sport. So in terms of what I do the Matter of Stats blog as a hobby, as a labour of love, a long labour of love, as I've mentioned to many people. I'm sure some of you have probably read about me on Twitter before, or maybe have seen me for the first time. My wife often says she's a widow for 6 months of the year, a football widow, because pretty much every spare moment I get during the course of the footy season and a fair bit of the off season is spent doing stuff around the Matter of Stats website. One of the things I love about it is it also provides me with an opportunity, though, to test things out that I use in my corporate life. So in my corporate life, I have two components. I do executive leadership work, but also I do predictive modelling work. So I work with corporates, data analytics work, I guess, more generally, to build predictive models, which customers most likely to leave next or take up a campaign, do some segmentation work and do some general data analytics work. So that's me in a 2-minute nutshell.
No, I love it. And I think there are an awful lot of wives and partners in our community who would very much feel your pain. Some of them AFL related, a lot of them racing related. But yeah, you're definitely in good company with other passionate people, shall we say. So in terms of, let's start at the basics. So AFL data, obviously that's part of why people get interested. Obviously a lot of people are passionate about AFL, but in terms of modelling AFL, there is an awful lot of data out there, especially compared to other sports, which when, I have people, come and talk to me about why they've built an AFL model. That's one of their reasons. There are all sorts of things out there. They start by going, hey, there's Fitzroy, so that makes it easy. So AFL data sources, obviously there's Fitzroy, which is amazing. Great quality repo and set of data that comes through that. Do you use that in what you do? Are there other sources that you use that you'd be happy to maybe point to for other people?
Sure. I mean, predominantly, yes, I'm using Fitzroy. I mean, prior to that, I had to find other ways to scrape. So actually, originally, before Fitzroy existed, I scraped by hand all of the information, or at least all of the scores and venue information off AFL tables. So talk about that being a labour of love. But predominantly, it's fantastic, as you say. So I'm trained at R. I've been using R now for 20 years, I think. So when Fitzroy came along, it was just fantastic. So
Perfect.
for any of you out there who haven't looked at it, for heaven's sake, have a look at it and thank the people that put it together. They're also passionate people doing it for no money at all. And this is a fantastic way to get access to AFL tables data, AFLW data now as well, and also footy wire data and a little bit more. So I predominantly use that for the work that I do. What I also need, though, because some of the models that I build incorporate bookmaker information, so I've been hand capturing that myself since about 2006. Usually opening markets, opening lines. So that's the predominant source of information that I use. And maybe I should just mention a second one of the kind of models that I build, which might provide a little bit of background for people that aren't familiar with the site. So predominantly for the modelling side of things, I'm looking to model 3 different aspects. I'm looking to model who's most likely to win, I'm looking to model what the likely margin's going to be,
Yep.
and I'm looking to attach a probability for victory to those margins. More recently, though, over the last couple of years, I'm also looking to predict the total scores in games, so I can start to get into the totals market.
And that's definitely what a lot of people in our wider community would be going for as well, particularly that probability, because obviously as soon as you have a probability, you can turn that into effectively your rated price. And if you're someone who's interested in, betting your model, which it's amazing in this community, a lot of people aren't in terms of AFL. They do it because they're passionate and interested about it. I'm always amazed. There are some big names in the community who don't at all and are very good at what they do. But if you are keen on betting a model, obviously as soon as you have a rated price, that's pretty easy to do. So no, definitely. I was interested in what you said earlier about like collecting bookmaker odds and the opening line and so on. Is that because you're using that as an input to your model or for testing purposes, or just because you're displaying it on the site as sort of a comparison metric?
That's a fantastic question. Up until a couple of years ago, it was an input. But I always found it slightly odd that I was using the price of the bookmaker that I was going to then bet with.
Mm-hmm.
Which always seemed a little odd. So now I have a number of models, and some of them, yes, do still use the bookmaker price. But in terms of the models that I use for wagering, they don't. So the models that I use for wagering are team ratings based. So they just purely look at the history of teams' performances. I don't just rate a team overall, I rate their offensive and defensive capabilities separately. And I can then use those, they're ELO based, for those who are familiar with ELO rating systems, which were first designed for chess, but they're now used for all sorts of things.
Yeah,
so I have exactly. So I have an ELO rating for every team offensively and defensively, which I can then use to come up with how many initially scoring shots I expect a team to register against another team.
Mm-hmm.
I can then overlay home ground advantage, or what I call venue performance values. One of the things I think slightly unusual about what I do is that I don't just treat home teams as having an advantage at a particular ground. I actually assess what's each team's historical performance been at grounds both home and away. Because I don't, for example, think the Gold Coast plays the same at Cardinia as maybe the West Coast do. So once I overlay all those, I can then come up with a expected score, scoring shots, which I can then convert to goals and behinds, which we can talk about if you like. And I then take that as a predicted margin and convert that to a probability. And even that exercise is an interesting one, which we can talk about as well if you like as we go.
Oh, definitely. I've got a lot of things there. It's interesting. Yeah, from my perspective, using price as a feature in some and not in others. It's interesting, obviously, from my perspective. Historic pricing data, I think, is incredibly valuable, and a lot of the people I work with use that as pretty strong features in what they build, particularly if you're using one of the Betfair prices, like the closing price or whatever. You're effectively using the wisdom of the crowd, and therefore that's helping to pull in a heap of other information that you might not have otherwise weighted. So no, it's very interesting that there are places where you choose to and places where you don't.
I think I agree with you, because the most informed prices in the market, I think, are those that are put together, such as your own. I guess the challenge is it's almost by definition hard to find a margin against the price that you already know is fully informed. So unless you think that there's something that you're able to incorporate through your models without using bookmaker information, it's sort of hard to imagine you're going to long-term find particularly large positive EV bets. But I don't doubt that some people are able to do it, and certainly I did for the first 10 years or so. But I've been successful 3 of the last 4 years just using these models which don't have any bookmaker input at all.
Very interesting. So obviously, the one of the things that people across the board are really interested in when we're looking at the current crazy world that we live in, and I've no doubt that when we get to a Q&A, there'll be questions, so I'm going to ask it first, is how did you deal with the season that was 2020? And how are you playing that into this year? So as a bit of context, this is funny. This is exactly the question that Curtis has just posted in. For context, we have a model on AFL model that we provide on the Betfair hub. We were talking about today that our predicted scores are really quite low compared to what the lines are, and we were sort of just agreeing that that's simply because our internal model is looking at last year and weighting that quite heavily, and it will learn over the first couple of rounds. The same way it did last year when it went the other way, and it was smart enough to pick that up. But how are you accounting for that, knowing in advance that last year's data isn't the same? Are you simply throwing it out? I assume you're not. How are you weighting 2020 compared to everything else?
Look, I took the position pretty early. First of all, last year I had a look at the in-running score progression data. I had a look at, typically, if you looked at the end of a game margin in a 2019, say, versus what it was 80% of the way into the match, it's quite linear. So I thought it was a reasonable assumption to start with, just to say, what I'm going to do is take all the information we've got from 2020 and blow it up by 25% and just treat it as if it was a normal season. As it turned out, I ended up doing that through the course of the year. I was actually just having a look this morning. The mean margin last year was 26 points per game. Mm-hmm. For the decade before that, it was about 36. So last year's margins were about 75% of what they were. So the 0.8 adjustment, if you like, or the 1.25, if you like, to ratchet it back up, seems pretty reasonable. So at this stage, and one of the things I think is really important as a modeler is to think about things that are testable. So don't feel like you have to make a decision and go, no, I've put the stake in the ground now, that's it. This is testable, so I'll keep testing it as I go. But for now, I'm just treating last year as if all the scores were bumped up by 25% and everything else is the same. I'll probably review that after a few weeks and see if that's still making sense. But from my point of view, for example, my predicted totals for this year look very much like the 2019 ones down up to 2020 ones. In fact,
which is probably a good sense check, right?
Exactly, but I'm quite bullish compared to the bookmakers as well. I've got about 10 points a game being scored, more points per game being scored than the bookmakers. So the bookmakers, 10 points per game less than the bookmakers. So I think the bookmakers are seeing a return to high scoring a bit more quickly than I am. But time will tell, and with the rule changes, who knows?
That was going to be my next question. So as soon as all the tweets started coming out this morning, my inbox started blowing up with people going, so what about this new medical substitute rule? And do you know how you're going to deal with it?
Well, as at 6:18, I can tell you. I mean, at the moment, we're not even clear what's going to be announced at 6:30 in the teams, right? My understanding, having read the site today, is they're going to name the usual 22-man squads tonight. And then an hour before the game tomorrow, they're going to name the medical sub. Given that, I mean, just from a practical point of view, my models are not automated. So I literally have to sit there. If there are any late changes, I have to sit there and run my models again. So the thought of having to sit before every game an hour before and wait to see who the particular medical sub is isn't particularly appealing. So what I'll probably do at this stage is take the 22 and rate the 22. And I should mention, one of the models I didn't mention earlier, that I use not for gambling purposes, but is my preferred model, if you like, is one that combines team-based rating data and player data. So what I've done is I've built a model which is able to predict the next Supercoach score for a particular player, and then I use those, incorporate those with the team data to come up with a margin and a probability. So at the moment, I'm just going to take the 22 as named and do it as I did it last year. But again, as I mentioned,
kind of play super straight backed until informed
until such time, I guess, until such time as we know how often the sub is going to be used. I mean, if it turns out that the sub is used one time in 15, then it won't matter so much. But if it turns out the clubs find a way to use it every game, then we've got an issue. And then
you're going to have to review. That's really interesting. I've got a question here already that's related to this, so I'll sort of throw it out. What's your approach to predicting early games in a season after player drafts in the new season?
So my ratings, I mentioned I do ratings, so I carry over the ratings from the previous season, but I drag them back towards zero. And the amount by which I drag them back towards zero, I've determined based on historical precedent around typically how much the teams in a typical draft season get dragged back towards zero. that's the first thing. So the model tends to drag everyone back towards an average team. But then in the ELO, remember I mentioned before I use
Yep.
the ELO system.
Yep.
One of the parameters in an ELO system is the K factor, which is how much the ratings respond to the most recent result. So I have much larger Ks for the early part of the season, which allows the models to adapt more quickly from those dragged back ratings to early season games. So they get dragged back towards zero, but then they move quite quickly in response to the games in the early parts of the season, as compared to later in the season when they don't move the ratings quite so much as the result of a single result.
No, I certainly get that. That's a good answer. Before we get too far into the weeds, I want to step back a little bit more because I know, looking at the list here, that there are people from the community that I know who aren't particular AFL modelers. They're here because they're interested in statistics and modelling as opposed to AFL. If you were talking to them, so people who have an interest in data, in analytics, in modelling, what would your advice be to someone starting fresh with AFL modelling? What sort of inputs would you be recommending that they look at? What sort of length of time? How would you suggest high level that someone go about building their first AFL model?
Sure. I would certainly recommend, look, it's possible to build these models in something like Excel, and if that's what you're comfortable with, certainly start.
Always a start.
But it is a heck of a lot harder. If you can bring yourself to do it, learn R or Python to give yourself that ability to, I guess, manipulate large amounts of data relatively quickly and build models and test them relatively quickly. I don't have a hell of a lot of background in Python, so I'll talk from an R perspective. Certainly, if you're getting into R, get Fitzroy. It gives you an enormous amount of information from scratch. If you also have a look on the Fitzroy page and some related pages, you'll see they've got some examples there about building how you might build some simple models. I always encourage people when they're getting into this space, though, pick a particular thing that you're interested in. What do I want to do? I want to build a model that does what? Just predicts the winners or predicts the margins. Have something that you're interested in, and then make that the first task that you decide to build. Build it a little bit at a time. Don't get too ambitious. Have a bit of an understanding too about the best way to go about testing a model. So really important, and I must admit in the early days of my career, I wasn't very good at doing this. It's really important that you take part of the information that you've got and set it aside so that you can use it later.
That was one of my questions.
I shudder to think how many of my early models were
overfit.
Yeah.
What breakdown do you do? So, some people, quite famously go like 80-20. That's a decent normal rule of thumb. What's your rule of thumb? Do you have one?
Yeah, probably 75-25, but it depends a bit on the data. I mean, in my day job, footy aside, I sometimes am dealing literally with millions of rows. Yeah. In which case you can afford to have your build, which is just like 10% and 90% test. But yeah, I think 75-25 is pretty reasonable, but make sure you've got enough left over in that 25% that it's a meaningful size data set so that you can genuinely test the significance of the things you're getting out.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice and something that, not necessarily, a lot of the guys here aren't modelling newbies, but certainly when you're new to modelling, it's very important to keep an eye on that. I'll get Ash to post a link to the Fitzroy tutorials that you suggested. A couple of other things for anyone who's interested. On our automation hub, there is an intro to modeling AFL in Python, and on our GitHub, there's a tutorial in how to do it in just using Excel as well. So we've got a couple of things there to try and make that beginning bit easy. So we'll shoot some links in there so that you can, other people who want to jump in can. The other thing I'm going to ask you about, because I'm interested in this, I've been watching your Twitter. That's part of why I reached out. I'm a long time fan, even though I'm not a particular AFL fan. I like how you present data, particularly about sport. And I notice you've been tweeting a fair amount about AFLW. And across the, more generally, I've heard an awful lot of people say, you can't model AFLW, there isn't enough data, they're not reliable enough, yada, yada. And that's not what you've been saying. And I am obviously a woman. I have a passion for women in sport and women more generally getting involved. So anything that's positive in that side, I'm obviously going to jump on. So what were your thoughts there?
Well, up until this year, I probably would have said the same as other people have said, that there wasn't much data. There wasn't enough data to build reliable models. But this year I decided, one, because there was 100 plus games, and two, because I've got so many scripts that were pretty readily reusable. What I decided to do was to build an AFLW model, which is exactly the same as the men's models, recalibrated for the women's data, but going back and looking at, can I build offensive and defensive ratings for each of the teams, work out what I should carry across from one season to the next, how am I going to map predicted margins, scoring shots to margins, and margins to probability. And this year I've been pretty successful. I think I'm accuracy something like 75% this year.
That's
and I think, and I use, probably be familiar, I use mean absolute error as the performance metric, and I think I'm in the 2021, something like that. And if I could just have 2 seconds soapbox on that as well. When you're doing with the performance metrics, traditionally, I suppose people would tend to build models and they'd use mean squared error or root mean squared error as their measure, and I did in the early days as well. But I do find that blowout results in particular mean that, well, those blowout results end up getting too heavily weighted in your models if you use that. So I'm much keener to use mean absolute error as the metric that I use for the models, which I guess quite simply means that you worry twice as much about a 40-point error as a 20-point error, rather than 4 times as much if you're using And one other thing, while I'm on the soapbox, when you are building a model, I don't think there's such a thing as a model that's good at both predicting winners and predicting margins. Whenever I've tried to do that in the past, I've ended up with a model that was okay at both, but not great at either.
That's a really good take.
Very, very distinctly decide whether you want to predict results or predict margins. And my last soapbox thing is, I think accuracy is actually a pretty poor measure of a model anyway.
Thank you.
Ultimately, people that win tipping competitions tend to be those people who got lucky with the majority of the 50-50 call. They're not inherently better forecasters. They just got the coin tosses a bit better.
And that's why, you know, we run datathons periodically to try and sort of engage people in, you know, sports and racing data and how you can use that in modelling. And we always make sure that we're not trying to do tipping things. We're trying to go, you know, prove to us that you have an opinion. You know, that's what I'd call it. You know, what's your opinion about this? Not is A going to beat B, but what's the likelihood of A beating B? And that's definitely, especially if you're interested in monetizing what you do, because it's very hard to monetize who's going to win, you know, because then what's value? When do you take a bet? Because you'll always be able to get on on who you think is going to win, but is $1.20 value on who you think is going to win? You know, in a lot of instances, probably not. Actually, you think it's like $1.50 shot. And then if you're taking the $1.20, long term, you're always going to lose. And that's where that opinion really matters.
And that's one of the hard conversations. I'm sure others will have found this as well. When you're chatting with people about this and you say, do you expect to win? And the truth is often like you don't. I'm quite happy to win 15% of the time on a 100 to 1 shot.
Yes.
It means I expect to lose 85% of the time. I don't care. Right? Ultimately, it's whether there's value in the particular position that I'm taking. So that is a very strange conversation to have with your family. I found it most when you tell them, no, I expect to lose most of the time.
Yeah, no, you're definitely in the right place. So it's something we talk about on Slack a lot. Is sort of where's your sweet spot, where's your edge. So, you know, for example, people who are betting racing, you've got people who really specialize in long shots. You know, sort of horses in a longer field that are rated like between $10 and $20. Like these aren't supposed to come in regularly.
Yes, exactly.
But that's not the point. It's just does your model predict that they'll come in more often than the market does? You know, and no, I love that. I hate betting favorites. Like I just won't do it. So I'm very interested in value betting an outsider. I think that's a far more interesting way to go. And especially if you're doing it sort of more recreationally, like, who wants to be on the favourite? I'm sure anyone who's got their own team would prefer that they were favourites. But I'm told by my father-in-law that my team's St Kilda, so maybe that also plays into why I like the outsider.
Maybe.
Sorry. So I've got a question here from Jason. So, do you have a go-to technique that you use early on in testing a hypothesis? Is there a preference for CART/tree-based traditional regression type, or do you venture into even more complex models?
Jason. I really like ensemble models. The more I use them, the more I like them. And the ensembles will be generally a combination of simple linear stuff and maybe a conditional inference forest or conditional inference tree or a random forest or XGBoost that I find I get much better performance. Provided I'm very careful and test carefully, because the impact of one bad base learner in an ensemble can be deadly. But provided you're careful about that and you use the ones that are fairly robust, I'm very keen on using ensemble models up front. If I had to pick, mind you, I guess if you're doing the simplest thing, a really simple model, doesn't hurt to do a linear regression to begin with. Maybe it turns out that most of the relationships are linear and they can be captured that way. But I'm usually going to go pretty quickly to adding in those more complex nonlinear things to look for interaction effects and looking to incorporate those in some kind of ensemble.
And in terms of your approach there, so when you're determining what weighting to put on different features, are you using your knowledge, your insight, your learnings to weight that, or are you relying more heavily on ML or whatever gets spat out at you? Just go, okay, this is what I'm putting in, and you do what you want with it.
I'll look within reason. I mean, if you look at the inherent relationship, or if there's a way of looking at the inherent relationship and they look crazy, like teams that are rated more highly are more likely to lose, those kind of things. If there's a completely counterintuitive, I think there has to be some human overlay for the face validity of the model, if you like.
Yeah.
But other than that,
I
think we do ourselves a disservice otherwise if we say, no. Well, we know better than this sophisticated model. I think you then start to get into potentially your own personal biases and your own personal quirks. And I think
machine learning, but only kinda.
Yeah, exactly. Machine learning, but only if it agrees with me.
Yeah, I hate that. That's something you see way too often. And my personal bent there goes, that's why automation really matters, because we're human and we're really bad at putting our lens over things. And if you like your model, you should just let it do what it does, and you shouldn't get in the way. And once you've got your set of ratings or whatever, and you've got your strategy nailed out, you do what it says. You don't then come in over the top and pick and choose and cherry. So
that's a really good point. No, I agree. And it makes me think back to last year as well, because home ground advantage was such a tough thing last year.
Yeah.
So I had an existing methodology which I used for coming up with, as I said before, venue performance values. And I had a lot of people during the course of the season saying, why aren't you changing it? And it's because all I'd be doing is imposing my biases. What I'm better off doing is let this thing run for the 12 months and then use the off season and go back and say, so I've completely rebuilt the whole venue performance value thing in my model this year, recognizing that we may even yet have another year like last year where home grounds meant something different.
Yeah, no guarantees at all.
Exactly, but I'm just not keen about this idea of midstream going in and going, oh no, again, I know better, I'm going to make some changes.
There was a question that came through on Slack before this, actually, earlier in the day, where they were talking about exactly that from last year, but particularly with a focus on this year. What do you think might happen in terms of the size, presence, or lack thereof of crowds? What do you think might happen if COVID restrictions stay strong in some instances, so that people are allowed to travel, but there are other restrictions imposed, delays imposed? We had people coming to the the Oz Open who weren't coping very well with 2 weeks in a hotel quarantine. Especially psychologically, that whole preparation thing was just completely out of whack. Obviously, you don't have an orb, you can't quite see what's happening in the future, but best guess, how is it just you're going to rely on last year and trust, or what's your sort of play on that?
Look, at the moment, pretty much, I don't think we've got enough data to really have a definitive call on that, to be honest with you. I guess it kind of harks back to what you think is the source of the notion of home ground advantage. I mean, traditionally it's been spoken about in terms of it's the support of the crowd, it's potentially being able to get the 50-50 calls, go your way, and it's ground familiarity. Oh, and I guess it's travel as well.
Yeah.
But we've still got travel, and we've still got the ground familiarity. I think they're a significant proportion of it. I guess the thing that's up for debate is the ability of crowds to, one, affect the players themselves directly, and also to affect the umps. And I don't know the answer to that. So at this stage, I'm just going to be using this rebuilt model that I've created as a result of some of the things I saw last year, but making no particular adjustments. I'm not going to, for example, say I think home ground advantage will only be X% of what it was in a traditional year, because I just don't think we've got enough data at that point, at this point, to make that call. But again, that's one of those things that's at least measurable during the course of the season to give you a flag if you're way off. But I don't
And
think
also, like we said earlier, it's where, particularly if you've got, if you're taking more of a machine learning approach, it's where leaning on that ability to continually learn and update and account for those changes, like we said with the margins that our model was predicting or not predicting. I think that's hopefully where maybe we can learn some of that if you've got the right sort of approach in your ML and you're capturing the right data.
You're absolutely right. So the home ground advantage component of my model actually does take history into account, and it does weight. It cuts off at a certain point, and it weights for recent games more heavily. So there will be some adaptability there. You're quite right. If it turns out that home ground advantage is fundamentally different, then the model will adapt.
So that's a question from me. So I've talked to different people about modelling AFL, and I know that when some of the rules changed a couple of years ago, it sort of impacted ability to use past data as effectively. Do you have a cutoff date in terms of how far back you go with the data you model because the game evolves so much, or do you just trust that it keeps evolving and it's an evolution of the past and therefore there is value in that? It just has to be weighted differently across time?
I guess two components to that. So for the actual team ratings bit, ELO system by its very nature, as long as you have a K that's big enough, by definition starts to heavily downweight games from long enough ago anyway. So I'm comfortable with that.
Yep.
With the home ground or the venue performance stuff, I think I'm currently using either only the last 5 or the last 6 seasons at most, and I think there's a cap of maybe 100 games or something. But there's a cut-off point for that calculation, because I think beyond that it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about how did the team of 7 years ago play.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. And especially as often the coaches have changed, the teams have changed, sometimes the actual home grounds have changed.
Exactly.
What's the relevance now? That basically, if you change every part of a car, is it still the same car?
Yeah, exactly. And that's another one of my, I guess, pet peeves in this space is the distinction between what I call descriptive statistics and predictive statistics.
Yeah.
You'll see them talking on the footy about Geelong have only won, or more likely have won. Geelong have won 19 of the last 20 matchups. So what? I mean, maybe the last 5 or 6 are relevant, but beyond that, it's just an interesting statistic. And if you think about it, you've got 18 teams, so you've got 150 thereabouts pairs of teams. You're going to be able to find some outliers in that 150 comparisons, no matter if you look hard enough. So finding those kinds of anomalies, I don't find very useful. And I think that is actually an important skill as an analyst, is to think about what do I think is predictive, and what do I think is the causal mechanism that makes this thing predictive. Why do I think playing on a Friday night might be important?
Yeah.
Because it tends to be later, and therefore there tends to be due, and therefore lower scoring. Something, but come up with some plausible predictive mechanism.
I had one of my first meetup guests yonks ago. He was talking about how easy it is to overfit things and sort of cut things so much that you start seeing patterns where there aren't. And he said that he was horse racing based mainly, but same principle applies. He was sort of going, oh, I'm so much better on Tuesdays than Wednesdays and all this. And eventually he's like, well, just do a sense check. And in his instance, he was looking at the days of the week and he just moduloed his results by 7. And it was just, It's like he was getting exactly the same distribution there. So it's like, you know, if it's not statistically relevant when you've got another comparison that's similar, well, you know, maybe you're thinking, yeah, a little bit too deeply into this and should back away slowly. I've got some really good questions here. So do you have an opinion on weather conditions and how you use that historically? And, you know, if you're playing it in, at which point do you take it in to, say, this weekend's games?
Yep. So I only take, up until a couple of years ago, I didn't use it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I'm in the totals market, I do use it in order to adjust the totals market. But I just have a cut-off. There are some interesting pieces, by the way. If you want to have a look, there are certain things. If you just look around the community, there are some interesting blogs on the relative effect of different levels of inclement weather and what it does to total scoring. But my rule now is that I tend to bet early in the week, so pretty much as soon as the totals markets go up. My rule is I will not do an overs bet if there's any forecast of rain at all for the venue for that day. Now, I know that's actually pretty conservative because if you know much about weather, forecast more than about 3 days out, not particularly good. So, you know, the chances are I may be being a bit conservative, but I just say if there's any signs of rain, I'm not taking over. So that's the only way in which I incorporate it. I don't physically go back in and try and recalculate the totals. I just use it as a heuristic which says I won't touch that market if there's rain about.
Okay, so a bit more of that human element coming in to sense check how you implement things.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah.
My sister-in-law, meteorologist, would agree with you that more than 3 days is a little bit of a finger in the air. But if you're betting early in the week, you don't have much more to rely on than that.
Exactly.
Interesting one. So have you thought about modelling / forecasting individual player stats for the purpose of pro bets or DFS or just for fun? And if not, how would you go broadly about tackling that challenge?
Okay, so have I done it? Have I thought about doing it for that purpose? No, but I do it for the purpose of the actual modelling. So I actually do a 1 game ahead forecast Supercoach score for every player, and that's those of you might be familiar with the term, or some of you in the modelling space with exponential smoothing. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much what the model is. So again, it takes into account the last, I think it's no more than 100 games over 4 or 5 seasons, and it takes the Supercoach score for each game. And then it says, what is therefore my prediction for the Supercoach score for this player for the next game? And then that's then incorporated with the team-based stuff to come up with what I call the MOSH play output. In terms of using it for other betting purposes, I don't have any more time. I mean, it would be nice. The other thing I have done as well, people might find interesting, I've done the same thing with the AFL player ratings. It's one of the data sources that's now available in Fitzroy is AFL player rating historical data. So I also now have built a 1 game ahead forecast for AFL player ratings. And in terms of the predictiveness of that, again, you might be interested in this. I find if I use my team-based model only, when I add in my prediction for Supercoach scores, I can reduce the mean average error by probably about a quarter of a point, probably about 2/3 of a point. If I instead use AFL player ratings, I get another quarter of a point on top of that. So it's not huge, but it's not insignificant either. So I guess the upshot of that is that AFL player ratings give a better indication of the likely outcome of a game than Supercoach scores, but not by much.
Do you have a hypothesis as to why that might be the case?
Well, my understanding is that, I mean, Supercoach is not, it's hard to know because they're both somewhat proprietary. Yeah. But the Supercoach scores, I don't think take into account the context as much. I think the AFL player ratings, it's not just what you do, but where you do it and how significant it was. So I think that's probably a better measure of a player's fundamental underlying work. So I think it's happy with that aspect.
It's an interesting one, and sort of, you know, going back when you started 15 years ago, you know, were you thinking that you'd use Supercoach ratings in your models? Like, it's interesting.
I wouldn't have known they existed.
Well, that's a fair answer too. Question on your betting habits is, why do you bet early in the week? Is that because you think at that point you have an edge over the margins that have gone up? Is that the play?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
take
I guess
advantage of mispriced lines and
exactly.
so on.
I think if there's going to be mispricings, I think they're more likely to be earlier in the week. Look, and also I'd be dishonest if I didn't say that's also something of a convenience. Because I have a pretty busy working career as well, working life as well. So it just sort of they tended to be more likely to be a window at the start of the week than towards the end of the week. So I got into the habit of getting the early markets and betting early.
You're killing me.
But
We can
yeah,
automate. That's easy.
yeah, we can talk.
No, I thought that, yeah, I think there is always good, yeah, if you've got an opinion that's different to the market, you know, that is a good time before they have a chance to calibrate across each other to get that edge. That's a good call. And on the betting one as well, do you ever use your model to build sort of multi/parlay bets, or are you just sort of more straight?
I don't like multis. I've written about multis. I mean, multis you're basically paying the vig multiple times over. You're multiplying the vig. So I don't think you're giving up some of your edge by betting multis.
If I could like get that quoted and stuck on the wall for a lot of people I know,
right.
I would. Yeah, that's a very good insight, and I think what I've seen certainly agrees with that. It's hard to get the value in essence, right?
Yeah. Well, even if there was value, you're giving up a larger chunk of each of the legs as a result of betting a multi than betting.
Yeah, which is therefore worse value at the end of the day.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. Do you do anything about what you'd consider a clear false prediction, i.e., a strong favourite that was upset? It's an interesting one. Is it then?
In terms of, I mean, to the extent that the result's surprising, then there will be a large error, and therefore the model will change the underlying ratings that went into that prediction. So I guess to that extent, the model itself is adjusting to the fact that not so much that a favourite was beaten, but it's just how different was the result from what it was expected in either way.
And I guess the argument there goes, well, as we said earlier, there's a difference between winning and the chance of winning. You know, even 100-to-1 shots get up sometimes, and that doesn't mean that they weren't 100-to-1 shot to start with. Yeah. You know, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that your rating was wrong. Yeah. You know, and that's where hopefully the machine learning can sort of kick in and account for if it wasn't right, but equally, you know, maybe your rating was right.
Yeah, exactly. We should expect 100-to-1 outcomes to happen 1% of the time. You know,
exactly. It's why you can't just lay everything that's long and hope that you're then going to win, because it doesn't play that way, or vice versa. Yeah, it's you know, we get something like 60. So in racing again, but about 60 runners that trade into 101, as short as you can get on the exchange in play, and then still lose every month. So you go. Statistically, just about perfect.
Yep.
This one may be a little bit of a plug by Robbie, but I'm a fan, so I'll read it out. A lot of people go to Matter of Stats for ideas, but where does Matter of Stats go for ideas? I think I know what the answer's looking for.
There are a number of wonderful blogs out there, some of which are linked on my site. Analysis of AFL being one of them, but there are a number of them out there. As I say, go to the site. The HPN Footy crowd do some really good stuff as well. Squiggle has some interesting pieces as well, and does a wonderful job aggregating the various forecasters that are out there, and added quite a few this year. There's an FMI. Some of you might have heard of FMI, where a bunch of us go to actually compete with footy predictions each year.
You've already given plugs to Fitzroy, and Fitzroy. worth noting, there's a shout out here from James Day, who's one of the maintainers of Fitzroy, and he said thanks very much for the shout out from you. That it's nice for the acknowledgement. Appreciate that.
They're good lads. They're good lads. Yeah. The other thing that some of your viewers might find interesting is the Monash competition. They run a competition each year with 3 different types of predictions. Just predict probability of victory, predict what the margin is, or predict the margin with a degree of uncertainty. So they're quite an interesting competition to have a look at as well.
I will also give a plug because I'm a fan of the work to Robbie Newer and his Chilling with Charlie podcast, which has a particular passion for AFL. I mean, I know it's more broad in terms of data analysis, but obviously the passion for AFL pervades. So I'm a big fan.
Yep.
I had another question there that went through my head. Yeah. So in terms of you mentioned Squiggle. So obviously I started all this by saying how important I think community is, and that in anything like this that can be so so individualistic and I guess lonely. It's
Yes.
really important to find other people to share that passion and enthusiasm with, and the wins and the losses, be they monetary or simply simply numbers. We're doing this because we're passionate about it, and it helps when you get to connect and share. Do you have advice for ways to sort of become part of that community if you're not there already?
Look, I think Twitter's a great source for that.
Yep.
I think a lot of the people that I've come to meet, some of them in real life, but also understand more about their websites, for the people that I've met on Twitter. So come along, have a look at Matter of Stats, and say hi, and I'm more than happy to sort of give some suggestions to people there. I mean, that's probably the strongest source that I've had. Maybe have a look at some of the websites. On the websites, you'll usually find there's some way to contact the people that run those websites, have a chat to them through there. So either of those mechanisms, I think, are a pretty good way. And I imagine through your forum as well, it's a good opportunity there. I mean, it's been actually pretty incredible for me if I think about it. When I first did this back in 2005, there really wasn't much of an AFL analytics community. I mean, there was Stephen Clark, there are a couple of others, I guess, but it's just been, I've been amazed, particularly the last sort of 4 or 5 years, just how burgeoning it is. And it's a pretty friendly bunch. I mean, I know Twitter can be a nasty place, but I haven't had
not
a
so
lot
much
of
in
issues.
this community. That's
Yeah,
what
I
I'm
haven't
saying.
had much. I've had a couple, but not much. So I think it's a really welcoming community, and so yeah, certainly come and say hi to us there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that credit needs to go to you too, that you are so open in what you do. People are always amazed when I talk about running things like these meetups. They assume that anyone who's serious or good at what they do is going to be really insular and protective and possessive and not want to share it. But actually, by sharing what you're doing isn't giving away everything. You can still do what you do and be successful at it. But then you have an opportunity to learn from other people as well. So I think the role modeling there, but also simply sharing the data and growing that community, like a lot of credit needs to go to you too. It's been quite a driving force in the space.
That's kind of you, thank you. And look, I do recognise that some people make a living out of this stuff, so I kind of understand they might want to be a bit more protective. I mean, I bet enough so that it's interesting but doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
But it's always been my philosophy in this space that, as you say, you get more back by making it very clear. I mean, last year I actually literally put up the code to the two programs that I use to do the ratings. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm more than happy to share the code that I've got with people. I don't feel anything proprietarial about it. The only condition being that if you do anything good with it, I want to know about it.
Yeah, share and share alike, right?
Exactly.
No, that's definitely my attitude too. Another one while we're on the betting front, what's your approach in terms of staking and risk management? Are you a Kelly person? Are you flat? What's your approach to staking?
Like any good trained economist, the answer to that is it depends. So I have three different. I run 3 funds, each with their own staking strategy. So my head-to-head fund, I bet to win a fixed amount. So I bet, so that means I bet a hell of a lot more sometimes on
shorties.
favourites. Mm-hmm. So that's what I use head-to-head. Line betting, it's more Kelly related. It's fractional Kelly, but it's based on the assessed edge. And then in the totals market, I just bet level stake.
Interesting.
And that's all been on the basis of looking back historically about what would have been best in hindsight. The other thing with my head-to-head is I don't bet away teams. Historically, for whatever reason, my models have never been as good assessing value for away teams as they have for home teams. So I only bet home teams.
I'm very interested in this because I've never had someone who has so strongly said, I've got 3 different staking approaches for 3 different parts of what I do. Normally, people are pretty passionate about one approach. And I do understand that you're sort of looking back. Do you worry that that and obviously you've considered this, but do you worry that might be overfitting against historic performance, or is it simply just the peculiarities of what you're doing that some work better on different ones?
I've got enough of a track record now, and not only that, but I haven't proven that just by looking backwards, but I've proven it by looking forward. So I've had this staking strategy now for a couple of years at least, and it's made money. So I'm very comfortable with it. I very much am data driven on these things. I don't think there is a right. I think people kid themselves about their ability to assess value head to head. I genuinely do think there are mispricings in the line market, and that they're measurable. And I do think the totals market is pretty much a lottery, and I may well get out of it after this year because I do think it's pretty hard to make money there, which is why I just have a small wager, more for instance. So I may be completely naive about it, but I'm comfortable. So,
no, I love it. Anyone who knows me, I love different approaches to things. I think it's very cool, very interesting. No, that's fascinating. Sorry, and it's taken me off where my train of thought was. No, that's absolutely fascinating. So I know we don't have very long, so I'm going to start wrapping up because we need to finish right on 7. Did you have any other particular shout outs that you wanted to flag before we wrap up?
Look, probably not, other than, I guess, just to reiterate your earlier comment that I think if it's an area that you're a little bit reticent to get into, genuinely don't be frightened. It is really a really welcoming community. So please come along. It is quite fun. Don't feel like any of the questions that you got are stupid questions. I know it's a cliche to say that there's no such thing as a stupid question, but there really isn't.
Cliches are cliches for a reason. 100% back you on that.
And all of us, even the grey hairs amongst us, have been in the same place as you were before. So certainly all the people I know are more than happy to reach out and help. So don't feel like you've got stupid questions, and feel free to reach out and please come over and visit the site and say hi.
I definitely will be hitting you up again later in the year. So there's quite a push at our end to offer another Brownlow Datathon, which we've done the last couple of years. So anyone who wants some motivation to get their act together and learn enough about AFL statistics to create a decent model, hopefully that can be the motivation for you. But I very much hope that we can lean on you a little bit closer to and see if we can get a bit of insight into how you're going about it. Anyone who's, and I've got to give the plug because I'm passionate about the exchange as well, but if you are looking at betting into these markets on the exchange, they are beautifully vibrant at the moment. They've developed hugely over the last few years when they've been a 2.5% commission rate, which obviously makes them very cheap to bet if you're winning. Strong support from our end, and they've just developed hugely over the last few years. So if you haven't had an opportunity to do jump in. Question from Joseph about what data does Betfair have to support AFL modelling? Reach out, Joseph. So hit us up at data@betfair.com.au. I think we've spoken before, but hit us up and we'll chat, because there is quite a range of data that we can share, as well as pointing you to the right places more widely to find it. And as Juppy says, 2.5% is the cheapest market on the exchange. There's nothing cheaper globally in terms of a commission rate. So, there's that. Thank you very much for the time, Tony. Very grateful for the opportunity to spend an hour. I never believe how fast it goes. Thank you. I'm very, very grateful for the insight and just how frank you've been and open. It's been excellent. And as I said, I'm not even particularly AFL passionate. I'm just passionate about the community. So I imagine that people like my team who are absolute AFL nuts are going to be even more excited than I am. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope we have the chance to do it again. And more broadly, thank you guys for being involved. Thanks for the great questions. They always make my job a lot easier. And I hope to see you guys on Slack. If there's any follow-ups that you want to ask on Slack, I know Tony said that he's kind enough to jump in and answer them. So do hit those up in the meetups channel on there. And more broadly, if you need anything from me or the team, you know where to find us, automation@betfair.com.au. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you,
Hope you have a
Karen.
great night and good luck with the season.
Thank you. You too.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
guys.